Robert Eric Wone was a 32-year-old attorney with a rising career, a solid marriage, and no known enemies. On the night of August 2nd, 2006, he left work late, arrived at a friend's townhouse in Washington, D.C. to spend the night, and was found dying less than 90 minutes later, stabbed 3 times in the chest, with no signs of struggle, in a home shared by 3 of his friends. There was no forced entry, no valuables taken, no witnesses. The 3 men inside claimed they'd been asleep, heard a noise, and rushed to find Robert wounded. He was lying on a pull-out sofa, dressed in a clean t-shirt and shorts. A knife rested neatly on a bedside table. Paramedics were immediately struck by how calm and tidy the scene appeared. One would later testify that it looked as though Wone had been stabbed, then showered, and placed in the bed. Investigators believe he had likely showered shortly after arriving, as was his routine. He had packed a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a night guard. By all accounts, he was preparing for sleep in a familiar home. Within the hour, he was dead. What followed was one of the most confounding homicide cases in recent memory. No murder charges were ever filed. The 3 housemates, Joseph Price, Victor Zaborski, and Dylan Ward, were eventually charged only with obstruction, conspiracy, and, for Price, tampering with evidence. To this day, no one has been held responsible for Robert Wone's death. But behind that acquittal lies a web of forensic oddities and chilling inconsistencies. Traces of what appeared to be seminal fluid were found in and around Wone's body, in places that deeply disturbed investigators. Needle marks were documented on his neck, chest, hand, and foot, none related to medical treatment. Toxicology came back clean, but experts later noted that exotic paralytics metabolize quickly and may never be detected unless tested for immediately. All 3 stab wounds were described by the medical examiner as clean, precise, and parallel, with no sign of a struggle. The lack of defensive wounds was glaring. So was the knife on the table, possibly wiped clean and planted. And the behavior of the housemates, both during and after the 911 call, raised serious doubts. Welcome to Bad Things. Join us as we unpack the timeline, examine the theories, and ultimately ask what most likely happened. Timeline: the night Robert Wone died. On the evening of August 2nd, 2006, Robert Eric Wone left his office at Radio Free Asia, where he had recently begun working as general counsel. He was married, had no children, and was planning to stay overnight with his college friend, Joseph Price, at Price's townhouse on Swan Street, Northwest, in Washington, D.C. Wone had known Price since their days at the College of William and Mary. The 2 remained close over the years. Wone, who lived in suburban Virginia, had a long day scheduled and preferred to avoid the commute home. He had arranged to stay with Price in advance. It was the first time he had stayed at the Swan Street home. The house was owned by Price and shared with his longtime partner, Victor Zaborski, and their 3rd housemate, Dylan Ward, who was in a polyamorous relationship with the couple. Price and Zaborski were upstairs on the 3rd floor. Ward lived on the 2nd floor. The guest room, a small room with a pull-out sofa, was also on the 2nd floor. According to the housemates, Wone arrived sometime around 10:30 p.m. He came with a small overnight bag containing a change of clothes, toiletries, and his dental night guard. At 11:49 p.m., Victor Zaborski called 911 from a 3rd floor phone. On the recorded call, he sounded panicked and out of breath, telling the dispatcher, "We need an ambulance. Our friend's been stabbed." He described an intruder entering the house and stabbing Wone. According to his account, he had heard a scream, found Wone bleeding in the guest room, and immediately called emergency services. Zaborski followed instructions, stayed on the line, and relayed information about Wone's condition, saying that he was still breathing, but making awful sounds. DC Fire and EMS paramedics arrived on the scene, around 11:54 p.m. First responder Jeff Baker later testified that what struck him immediately was how clean and calm everything appeared. One was laying on his back on the pull-out sofa, wearing a grey t-shirt and dark gym shorts, with 3 neat stab wounds visible on his chest. Blood was minimal, just a few spots on the bed, as Baker described. He also noted the bed was made with the sheet tucked under one's body, and the knife sat cleanly on a bedside table. Baker's partner testified that none of the 3 residents seemed especially frantic or involved in helping one when they arrived. When EMTs entered, Joseph Price was sitting on the edge of the bed in his underwear. Baker asked what had happened, and Price reportedly answered only, "I heard a scream," then walked out of the room. Zaborski was seen crying in the hallway, while Ward was described as quiet and withdrawn, avoiding eye contact. Shortly after midnight, one was declared dead at George Washington University Hospital. Police arrived on the scene quickly after the paramedics and secured the house. Officer Gregory Ailmian was among the first to speak to the residents. He asked what had happened, and according to his testimony, Dylan Ward began to respond before Price gave him a sharp look that silenced him. Ailmian later recalled that Ward's demeanor shifted instantly, like a child getting in trouble, and Price stepped in to speak instead. Price told the officer that he heard the security chime, thought someone had come in through the back door, and found one stabbed. He also mentioned a black guy he had seen in the alley previously, suggesting the intruder may have been him. Price pointed out the knife next to the bed, which police noted as an unusual detail to mention so early. The scene appeared undisturbed. No signs of forced entry were visible, no windows were broken, and expensive electronics and valuables had been left untouched, including Won's watch, wallet, and BlackBerry. The next morning, Won's wife, Catherine Wone, was informed. She had last spoken to Robert by phone around 10:30 p.m., shortly after he arrived at the Swan Street house. She later confirmed that he had sounded relaxed and tired, ready for bed. The autopsy was performed by Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. Lois Goslanowski. It revealed 3 stab wounds, 2 to the chest and 1 to the abdomen, described as precise and parallel. Dr. Goslanowski noted the absence of defensive injuries on one's hands or arms, which she found highly unusual. The uniformity of the wounds indicated that one had not moved or struggled during the attack. In her opinion, the injuries were consistent with a person who had been incapacitated or immobilized. The autopsy also revealed puncture marks in several areas: the neck, chest, foot, and hand. None of these corresponded with medical intervention or IV placement, and the paramedics confirmed they had not inserted needles into those locations. Toxicology tests returned negative for common drugs like opiates, cocaine, and barbiturates. However, authorities later admitted they had not initially screened for certain fast-acting anesthetics or paralytic agents, which may have left the system quickly or gone undetected. Investigators discovered a white towel near Won's body that had blood on it. Analysis later revealed that this towel had fibers that matched the blade of the knife, but none of Won's shirt fibers were found on the knife, leading some forensic analysts to suggest the blood may have been transferred onto the knife via the towel, rather than through stabbing. Police also noticed a missing knife from a cutlery set in Dylan Ward's bedroom. The set had 1 slot empty. Investigators obtained the same model from the manufacturer and found that it closely matched the size and characteristics of Won's wounds. The knife found next to the bed, by contrast, did not. This discrepancy led to speculation that the knife on the nightstand was not the murder weapon, but a planted item. A blood-sniffing cadaver dog later alerted in 2 places: the lint trap of the clothes dryer upstairs and a drain in the backyard. Investigators believed this may suggest evidence was washed and dried. However, no definitive forensic matches were made between those locations and Won's blood. Among other items recovered in the search was an issue of the New Yorker in Ward's room, open to an illustration of a man lying dead in bed. Police logs also listed BSM restraints, manuals, and sex devices found in the home, particularly in Ward's bedroom. Meanwhile, during formal questioning, each of the 3 housemates repeated their version of events, that they were asleep, heard a noise or scream, and discovered one already wounded. None claimed to see or hear an intruder. Each lawyered up shortly afterward. 2 years later, in 2008, prosecutors charged Price, Zaborski, and Ward, not with murder, but with obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and, for Price, tampering with evidence. At trial in 2010, none of the men testified. The case was heard in a bench trial by Judge Lynn Leibowitz, who, after 5 weeks, acquitted all 3. She described the prosecution's theory as very probable, but said the evidence didn't clear the legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. She noted their demeanor was inappropriate, their stories discordant, and the intruder theory implausible, but concluded that the government had not ruled out the possibility that the men simply did not know what happened. Separately, Cathy Wone filed a $20 million civil wrongful death lawsuit in 2008, alleging a cover-up. During the discovery process, all 3 men invoked their Fifth Amendment right and declined to answer questions. In 2011, the suit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Cathy later said, "They can rot from the inside out from all the secrets they chose to keep. That's their choice. I chose to move on." To this day, Robert Wone's murder remains officially unsolved. The U.S. Attorney's Office and D.C. Police have repeatedly affirmed that the case is still open. No one has ever been charged with his killing. Theories. What could explain the death of Robert Wone? From the moment Robert Wone's body was discovered, investigators found themselves staring at a crime scene that didn't behave like one. The spotless room, the surgically clean wounds, the lack of blood, and the composed demeanor of the only 3 people in the house quickly made one thing clear: someone was lying. But figuring out who and why has led to years of conflicting theories, some emerging from law enforcement, others from legal arguments, and a few from the public itself. Here are the leading explanations that are being proposed. Number 1. A stranger broke in and killed Robert Wone. This was the original claim made by the housemates, and the one they maintained through all police interviews and court appearances. According to them, an unknown intruder slipped into the house undetected, stabbed Robert Wone, and vanished without leaving a trace. It was Victor Zaborski who first voiced this possibility, unprompted, during the 911 call. "I think someone came in through the back door," he told the dispatcher. Joseph Price repeated the idea to responding officers, even referencing the door chime as an indication that someone had entered. He also mentioned rather quickly that there's a black guy who lives in the alley, pointing subtly to a potential suspect. Defense attorneys in the 2010 trial argued this theory was prematurely dismissed by police. They claimed that investigators became fixated on the 3 men too quickly, failing to follow up on neighborhood leads or reports of break-ins. David Shirtler, Ward's attorney, told reporters, "An intruder came in through the back door and killed Wone. That's what happened. And instead of looking for him, they went after my client." Critics of this theory, however, point to several glaring issues. First, there were no signs of forced entry. Second, nothing was stolen. And third, investigators found no trace evidence, no unknown DNA, no muddy footprints, not even a fingerprint, to support the idea that anyone else had entered. Even Judge Lynn Leibowitz, while acquitting the men, described the intruder story as implausible. But under the law, implausible is not the same as impossible, and the defense's job was to sow reasonable doubt, not provide an alternative culprit. Number 2. Robert Wone was murdered by one or more of the housemates, possibly by accident. This theory suggests that the crime was not premeditated, but that something happened inside the house, possibly a confrontation, an argument, or an accident, and that one was killed by someone he knew. The subsequent cleanup and silence were part of a spontaneous cover-up. According to the government's original position, this theory wasn't based solely on motive or suspicion, but on the physical evidence. The needle marks, the lack of defensive wounds, the suspiciously clean scene. Investigators argued that these factors pointed to a staged crime, likely orchestrated by someone inside the house. But this theory suffers from a major problem. There's no clear explanation of why Robert Wone would suddenly become the target of violence. He was a guest, a friend, and had no known personal conflicts with any of the men. There were also no sign of struggle, shouting, or any event that would indicate a confrontation. Moreover, prosecutors in the 2010 trial declined to charge anyone with homicide. While they strongly hinted that Price may have tampered with the weapon and even pulled it from Wone's body, they couldn't tie the fatal act to any specific moment or individual. Without that, the theory remains circumstantial, a possibility, not a provable sequence. Even the judge in her verdict noted that it is very likely Mr. Price pulled the knife from Wone's chest, but she added, "The government has not proven that he did so with criminal intent." So while this theory doesn't require imagining a break-in, it does lean on an unknown scenario, a moment that no one has described, and for which no one has offered a motive. Number 3. The murder was sexual in nature, and the assault was covered up. Of all the proposed explanations, this is perhaps the darkest, and the most heavily debated. The theory is rooted in forensic findings that suggest Robert Wone may have been sexually assaulted before his death. The autopsy revealed what appeared to be seminal fluid in and around his body, including in the rectum. There were also multiple needle marks in his neck, chest, foot, and hand that had no medical justification. Investigators posited that Wone had been injected with a paralytic agent and rendered immobile. Supporting this theory was the discovery of BSM restraints and sex equipment in Dylan Ward's bedroom, along with a collection of manuals on pain and control. Some of the books were marked with tabs and highlighted sections. An arrest affidavit filed in 2008 explicitly suggested this possibility. It proposed that Wone had been incapacitated and then violated, possibly as part of a sexual experiment gone wrong. However, this theory was never brought into the criminal trial. Prosecutors deliberately avoided it in court, likely due to the high burden of proof required for sex crimes. As a result, much of the sexual evidence, the semen, the needle marks, the sex toys, was not evaluated in front of a judge. And there were major limitations. No paralytic was ever detected in Wone's blood. No one was charged with sexual assault. Defense lawyers dismissed the sex-related evidence as irrelevant and prejudicial, suggesting it was being used to smear their client's character based on lifestyle. Still, to many observers, the presence of bodily fluids, the absence of struggle, and the surgical precision of the wounds remain troubling. Even now, this theory continues to fuel public speculation, though it was never officially prosecuted. Number 4. The real killer was someone else, possibly Michael Price. At trial, prosecutors floated a lesser-known possibility that someone other than the 3 housemates had killed Robert Wone, someone they were protecting. That someone was Michael Price, Joseph Price's younger brother. Michael had a history of drug use and burglary. He also had a key to the house and knew the alarm system. According to court documents, Michael was not at the scene according to the defendant's account, but prosecutors suggested he could have arrived unannounced, committed the crime, and been covered for afterward. The theory was introduced briefly during the 2010 trial, but was not central to the case. Judge Leibowitz ultimately rejected it, stating that no evidence placed Michael Price at the house that night. He had an alibi, and there was nothing linking him to the crime scene. Supporters of this theory point to the possible motive. If Michael had committed the murder during a break-in or drug episode, his brother may have chosen to cover for him rather than expose him. The idea of a secret fourth person, someone not present when police arrived, fits with the otherwise unexplained presence of needle marks, the staged crime scene, and a missing knife. But without surveillance, eyewitnesses, or forensic links, this theory is entirely speculative. Michael Price was never charged. His name appeared briefly in filings, but no one could place him at Swan Street that night. Number 5. All 3 housemates know what happened, but are hiding it. This final theory doesn't claim that any one person committed the murder, only that the 3 men collectively concealed the truth. The prosecution referred to this as a coordinated cover-up, and it was the central argument in both the criminal case and the civil lawsuit brought by Kathy Wone. In support of this, prosecutors pointed to the behavior of the housemates, the delayed 911 call, the clean scene, the lack of blood, the uniformity of their stories, and their refusal to answer direct questions. During the civil case, all 3 invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and declined to testify. In her verdict, Judge Leibowitz acknowledged the suspicion. "It is very probable that the defendants know more than they have said," she wrote. However, she emphasized that suspicion is not evidence, and that the law required her to acquit. This theory assumes complicity rather than direct action. It allows for any number of scenarios, from one of them committing the crime to all of them witnessing it, or even just discovering the aftermath and deciding to cover for someone. It's flexible, but vague. And that's its weakness. It doesn't explain motive, means, or moment. It simply alleges silence. In the absence of hard evidence, that silence might be strategic, or it might be genuine ignorance. Judge Leibowitz concluded, "The government has not eliminated beyond a reasonable doubt the real possibility that the men simply didn't know what happened." Robert Wone arrived with an overnight bag, changed clothes, and prepared for bed. Within 90 minutes, he was dead. 3 men were home. No one else came or went. Whatever happened, happened inside. The intruder theory collapses quickly. No forced entry, no missing items, no forensic trace. There was no evidence anyone entered the house, the judge noted. The idea of a stranger slipping in, killing silently and disappearing without a trace, defies logic. An accident or sudden fight? Just as unlikely. No signs of struggle, no call for help, no defensive wounds. The stabs were clean and deliberate. One had time to resist, but didn't. The physical evidence points to a controlled scene. Robert Wone was likely chemically paralyzed, injected with something fast-acting and undetectable by standard toxicology. Needle marks were documented in 4 locations: neck, chest, foot, and hand. No medical reason was given, and first responders confirmed no injections were administered during treatment. Authorities later acknowledged that specific tests for paralytics were not done early, calling it a possible oversight. Substances like succinylcholine can vanish from the bloodstream within minutes, but the physical punctures remained. The autopsy also documented the presence of Robert Wone's own seminal fluid, not just on his genitals but on and inside his rectum. There was no sign of consensual activity. His widow described their marriage as happy and monogamous. He had changed into bedclothes shortly after arriving and had no known sexual history with any of the men. The placement of the fluid, combined with the paralysis, suggested to investigators that Wone was assaulted while immobilized. That theory was not argued in court, but it was never walked back either. The official affidavit called it consistent with a sexual assault of some kind. After the stabbing, the cleanup appears to have been swift and deliberate. Despite one of the wounds piercing the heart, there was minimal blood at the scene. Just a few small stains. The bed was neatly made under the body, and the t-shirt had 3 precise punctures matching the stab wounds. No fabric tearing. The knife placed on the bedside table lacked shirt fibers but carried fibers from a towel. That towel, bloodied, was nearby. The implication was clear. The blade was wiped with Wone's blood and positioned afterward. A similar knife was missing from a cutlery set in Dylan Ward's room, a make and model that matched the wound dimensions more closely than the one found. That missing knife was never recovered. From a forensic standpoint, the scene told one story, but the behavior of the housemates told another. When paramedics arrived, they found Joseph Price sitting calmly near the body. He offered only, "I heard a scream." Dylan Ward was described as emotionless. Victor Zaborski was crying, but one EMT testified it felt forced. None were providing CPR or actively helping. When a police officer asked what happened, Ward started to speak, until Price cut him off with a glare. That moment was remembered clearly by the officer, who described Ward as shrinking back like a kid who got in trouble. That dynamic, one man speaking for the group, never changed. But the most troubling inconsistency came from the timeline. Zaborski placed the 911 call at 11:49 p.m. On that call, he said he'd heard a scream. Later, he told police the scream was actually his own, triggered when he saw Robert's body. But a neighbor reported hearing a scream between 11 and 11:30. If that was Victor's scream and not Robert's, then there may have been a 15 to 45-minute delay before help was called. That window remains unexplained. It would have been long enough to redress the body, wipe down surfaces, choose a narrative, and get rid of anything that didn't belong. If the scream and the call don't line up, something else was happening in between. When questioned under oath, none of the three men testified. In the civil case, all invoked the Fifth. They denied wrongdoing, but offered no alternative theory beyond the intruder, which neither police nor the court found believable. The judge acknowledged the circumstantial weight, writing that it was very probable the defendants know more, but emphasized that probability isn't proof. And in court, that mattered. Outside of court, a different standard applies. So what most likely happened? Robert Wone was chemically incapacitated, likely with a paralytic agent that metabolized quickly and left no trace in standard testing. While immobilized, he was assaulted, not violently, but deliberately. The physical evidence suggests control, not chaos. He was stabbed 3 times with a knife never recovered. The scene was cleaned, the story coordinated, and the delay, however short, used to remove or reposition whatever might reveal what really happened. Whether one man acted or 3 men stayed silent, the evidence points inward. No stranger walked in. No accident explains it. The house was calm, the responses too practiced, and the silence too complete. Until someone tells the truth, Robert Wone's murder remains unsolved. But the most likely explanation has been inside that house the entire time.